Old man, put that antique down before you hurt yourself. Gunny Rourke's voice cracked through the air like a slap across a firing range already heavy with frustration. The entire sniper team turned. At the far end of the range, Harold Katon stood motionless, solid as an old stone, cradling a weather-worn M40 in his hands. He didn't answer. His eyes simply followed the tilt of each blade of grass, the thin currents of rising heat swirling into faint layers. Rourke took another step forward, his voice soaked in contempt. You're trespassing on a live-fire range for special operations. You don't belong here. A young Marine tightened his grip on the spotting scope. All morning they hadn't hit a single target past 700 yards. The ballistic computers kept spitting errors. The wind shifted like it was mocking them. And now they were watching an old man stand there calmly, as if he understood something technology couldn't touch. Rourke raised his voice again. You think standing here and staring is enough to understand this drill? This isn't some farm lesson, old man. Harold finally spoke so softly that the entire range fell silent on its own. It's not one win today. It's 3. The stillness stretched for half a beat. A few Marines froze at the strange, razor-sharp truth in his words. But to Rourke, it was nothing more than another provocation. He lunged forward, grabbing Harold's shoulder in irritation. I warned you. Leave this range. Now. Harold did not move. He didn't flinch. He didn't show fear. His eyes simply lowered to the hand gripping his shoulder, then lifted slowly back to meet Rourke's quiet, steady, and deep enough to make the younger man blink. And then a siren echoed from far down the road, sharp, urgent, cutting into the moment with a sound no one expected. The young Marines turned. Rourke's hand slipped away. The siren grew louder with every second, like a warning that something was rushing toward them, something powerful enough to overturn the entire balance of authority on that range. If you believe true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence carried by those who have walked through war, subscribe to service honor stories, so we can preserve the memories, dignity, and deep respect owed to the quiet heroes of our own. Harold did not resist. He simply looked down at the hand Rourke was digging into his shoulder, the knuckles tightened by a young man's untempered anger. Then Harold's gaze slipped away from that grip and drifted toward a small blade of grass a few meters away. The blade bent slightly, then shifted direction, a sign no one but him noticed. The wind was changing, and Harold quietly registered it long before any of the expensive devices in the young Marine's hands could react. His silence spread outward like a widening ripple. A few Marines froze, unable to explain why something suddenly felt wrong. Not wrong because Harold was standing there, but wrong because of how they had looked at him. Miles, the youngest of the team, felt a strange sensation crawl up his spine. He had seen Harold many times around the base, always quiet, always neat, always slipping away before anyone paid attention. And now, that still posture made Miles feel like he was looking at something both familiar and far too large for him to fully understand. Rourke was still tense, but Harold's silence made him falter. Not out of fear, but because he felt as if he were trying to shake a wall that had no intention of resisting. The thing that unsettles a man the most is not anger. It is the absolute calm that confronts his anger without moving. Harold continued standing the same way, his shoulders straight, one hand relaxed beside the old M40. No explanation, no defense. Only a stillness heavy enough to feel like a memory no one else knew. And at that moment, the memory opened. A damp forest smell rushed back. Mud mixed with the bitter scent of old gunpowder. Harold was once again lying on the dark floor of a jungle where the sky was swallowed by a canopy of leaves. Across his back lay the M40, heavier than anything he'd ever been ordered to carry in training. Not heavy because of steel, but because of responsibility. Through the rain, a fading voice crackled over the radio. We're pinned down. If that position isn't shut down, we can't get out. Harold had been nothing more than a young soldier then, but the wind had changed that day too, just like now, and he had been the only one to see it. The memory closed as quickly as it appeared. Harold returned to the present, standing beneath the hot sun of the firing range, still silent. The calm in his eyes weighed more than all of Rourke's shouting, heavy enough that a few young Marines looked away, unable to understand how an old man could stand there unshaken in the face of such open disrespect. Miles swallowed hard. He knew something wasn't right. Not with Harold, but with the way everyone was treating him. He took a breath, raised his hand, and said, Gunny, my scope's acting up. Request permission to step out for a minute to get it checked. Rourke only nodded, not even looking at him. He was too wrapped in a frustration that was losing its power. Miles stepped off the firing line, walking faster than he needed to. But inside, the urgency wasn't about broken equipment. It came from the sense that if he didn't act now, something was about to spiral far beyond what any of them could control. He moved behind a row of vehicles, pulled out his phone with fingers that trembled slightly. There was only one person he could think of, the base's master gunnery sergeant, the man who knew more stories than any young Marine had the right to touch. Miles dialed without hesitation. It was Harold's quiet, mysterious stillness that pushed him to act, and the moment he made that call, it became the first spark that would set the hidden truth in motion, a truth no one on the firing line had even begun to sense. The next wave of humiliation was coming, a final test before the real storm arrived. Gunny Rourke folded his arms and glanced down at the M40 in Harold's hands with unmasked contempt. That rifle belongs in a display case, not on a firing line. The words fell heavily across the range. A few young Marines laughed out of reflex, but the laughter died quickly, awkward and thin. They couldn't look Harold in the eye, and they didn't dare look at Rourke either. A faint sense of wrongness crept through their expressions. Harold didn't respond. He simply lowered the M40 slightly, letting the stock slide across his palm. In that brief movement, a dent appeared, small, deep, old, as if it had traveled with the rifle for a lifetime. Miles stood at a distance but caught sight of it immediately. He frowned. An old rifle having a dent wasn't unusual. But the feeling that hit Miles wasn't normal. That dent didn't look like a scrape. It looked like something had once struck it hard. Harold brushed his fingertip lightly across the dent. It was an unconscious gesture, but the moment his skin skimmed the worn wood, a memory surged back, dark and sudden, flooding his mind like black water breaking open. A dense jungle. The stench of wet earth. A young man's body pressed flat against the ground mud, crawling up his sleeves. Bullets thudded into the tree trunk behind him, sending back sharp, cold echoes. Harold had just turned 19, and that dent had been made by a piece of shrapnel that landed only inches from his hand. A platoon was trapped on the far side of the valley. A radio screamed with desperation, and Harold, lying there in the monsoon-soaked jungle, clutching a rifle that was still practically new, knew that if his shot was late by even a heartbeat, none of those men would make it out alive. The memory closed, and Harold stood once more on the sunlit firing range, silent, as though the past had never touched him. Rourke saw that silence and grew even more irritated. "Are you deaf? Did you hear what I said?" Without waiting for an answer, he grabbed Harold's shoulder and yanked hard, as if dragging a lost old man away from somewhere he didn't belong. The entire team held their breath. Rourke rarely used force like that. But Harold only swayed slightly. No resistance. No anger. No reaction at all. And the emptiness of that response pulled Rourke's fury inward until it began hollowing itself out. Miles watched everything with a tightening ache in his chest. He stepped back, sticking one hand into his pocket, fingers closing around the phone that had begun to vibrate. He'd already called Master Guns Phillips earlier, driven by a feeling that something bad was coming. And now the call was going through. He lifted the phone to his ear. "Master Guns, it's me, Miles." His voice was low, strained, trying hard to stay calm. "Gunny Rourke he's about to drag an old man off the range. The man has an M40. His name is Miles." Stopped for half a second, as if the name itself sent a cold current up his spine. "Harold Katon." The other end of the line went silent. Not for a few seconds, but for so long, Miles wondered if the connection had dropped. Then a deep, aged voice rose, heavy, unmistakable. "Miles, say that again." Miles swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Harold Katon." No reprimand came. No sharp breath. Only a second's silence, longer, deeper, and then a short command that made the hair on Miles's arms stand on end. "Don't let anyone lay a hand on him again. Keep everything as it is. I'll call higher up." The call ended. Miles tightened his grip on the phone. He turned back toward Harold, the man still standing there, Rourke's hand gripping his shirt, yet his eyes calm and still, like the surface of a lake untouched by wind. Miles didn't understand what was happening. But he knew one thing for certain: the man being humiliated before them was no ordinary man. And his silence was the sign of a coming quake gathering strength where no one could see it. The conflict had been pushed to its breaking point, and from that moment on, the people with real authority began to move quietly, inevitably, like an underground current surging toward the firing range, ready to sweep away every mistake that had just unfolded. And right then, the first sound of intervention began forming in a place no one expected, Master Gunnery Sergeant Phillips shut down every question in his mind the moment he heard the name Harold Katon. He didn't waste a single second. His hand lifted the desk phone, his voice rough but decisive, like a battlefield command. "Connect me to Colonel Hale's office. Priority status." A young officer on the other end responded with confusion, but the moment he heard the words Katon case, the entire tone shifted. No hesitation. No protocols. The line opened immediately. Colonel Warren Hale had been sitting in a budget meeting, something that gave him more headaches than any field operation ever had. But when he heard Master Guns say, "Sir, Katon is being forced off the firing range by your Marines," Hale stood so abruptly that the chair behind him slammed into the wall. He spoke only one sentence, clear, cold, and heavy with authority. "Prepare the vehicle. And get the Sergeant Major. We're leaving now." No one in the room asked why. They all knew Hale reacted like this only when a matter touched the highest kind of honor, or when a name surfaced from the deepest, most guarded layers of Marine Corps memory. Meanwhile, out on the range, things were unraveling faster than any of the young Marines could process. Rourke, still drowning in his anger and humiliation at being challenged by a silent old man, pulled handcuffs from his belt. His voice grew harsher. "You're creating a hazard during live fire. I'm obligated to remove you from this area." The Marines nearby felt a chill run down their spines. All morning they had assumed this was just an uncomfortable argument, but the moment the handcuffs appeared, the entire atmosphere changed. It was as if someone had crossed a line no one was ever meant to touch. One young Marine whispered, "Something's wrong." No one answered, but every one of them felt it. Rourke stepped in again, grabbing Harold's arm with more force this time. And at the exact moment his hand touched the old man's sleeve, Miles heard a sound that made his heart jump. Screeching brakes, dust kicked into the air, a sound impossible to mistake anywhere on base the command convoy was arriving. The entire range froze. No one laughed. No one exchanged glances. A few swallowed hard, but didn't dare speak. Seconds later, dark vehicles rolled into the area, stopping just close enough for the Marines to feel the weight of the command presence pressing down on them. The doors opened. Heavy-soled boots stepped out in slow, deliberate rhythm. Hale emerged first. His face wasn't angry, wasn't shouting, just taut, like steel reaching its final shape. The sergeant major walked beside him, a man built like a slab of stone, carved from discipline and war. No one breathed deeply. No one moved. Even Rourke, whose hand had been gripping Harold's shirt, froze on the spot. His fingers lifted away from the old man's shoulder, as if he had touched fire. The young Marines looked from Hale to Harold, then back to Hale. Their colonel's expression told them everything. Whatever was unfolding was not only serious, it touched what the Corps called a living legacy. The convoy had not arrived as punishment. It stepped onto that range like an unannounced ceremony, a reminder that one man's silence can outweigh the shouting of an entire battalion. And in the moment Colonel Hale walked into the center of the range where Harold stood alone, the balance of power shifted completely, as if every moment leading up to this had been guiding them toward what was about to be revealed. The escalation ended the instant the highest authority set foot in that quiet valley, and from here the truth was ready to break open in ways none of them could have imagined. For in the very next breath, every Marine on that range would witness a recognition, the kind that only history itself has the right to bestow. Colonel Warren Hale didn't look around. He didn't survey the scene. He didn't ask a single question. He simply walked straight toward Harold Katon, as if everyone else on the range had disappeared from view. Rourke stood in his path, but Hale didn't stop. He stepped past the gunnery sergeant as though the man didn't exist, forcing Rourke to stumble half a step back without realizing it. Hale's eyes dropped to Harold's shoulder, where the imprint of Rourke's rough grip was still visible. His face hardened, and his voice dropped into something dangerously calm. "Take your hand off him, now!" Rourke jerked his hand back instantly. His fingers trembled slightly, as though he had just pulled away from the edge of a sharpened blade. Hale stopped in front of Harold. No raised voice. No explanation. No display of superiority. He came to attention, and he saluted. Not a polite salute, but the kind reserved for men the military considers living legacy. "Mr. Katon," Hale said, each word weighted with decades of service. "I apologize for the way you were treated. There is no justification for it." The entire firing range fell silent. No one could believe what they were seeing. A sitting colonel, the commanding officer of the entire training center, was saluting an old groundskeeper they had always assumed was just a man who raked leaves and cut grass. Rourke turned pale as if the blood had drained out of him in an instant. Hale turned to the row of snipers standing stiff as statues. "Take a good look." He pointed toward Harold, his voice tightening with a reverence that none of the Marines had ever heard before. "This is Chief Warrant Officer 5, Harold Katon, the man who wrote the foundation of the extreme crosswind doctrine you're studying in your advanced sniper course." A wave of shock rippled through the young Marines. Some instinctively looked at Harold's battered M40, no longer a relic, but a fragment of living history. Hale continued. "During the Vietnam War, no one knew his real name, but the enemy did." He paused, allowing the weight of the next words to settle. They called him Shade of Dak To, the silent shadow of Dak To. A shiver moved through the ranks, not because of the name, but because of the way Hale spoke it, as if it had once echoed through jungles dense enough to swallow sound, a name murmured with the kind of fear even hardened soldiers recognized. Rourke couldn't keep his balance. His legs felt hollow, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Every ounce of pride, bravado, and anger he had thrown at Harold minutes before now shriveled into something humiliatingly small. He understood who he had insulted, and the enormity of that mistake was so overwhelming he couldn't raise his head. Harold remained silent. He didn't look proud. He didn't try to soften anyone's discomfort. He simply stood there, steady and calm, as if recognition or anonymity made no difference to the person he was. Hale lowered his salute and dipped his head slightly, a gesture of respect so rare in a world built on discipline and rank. "We owe you more than any apology could ever repay." A new silence settled over the range, not the silence of confusion, but the silence of reverence. A reverence so deep that no one dared speak loudly, or even breathe too heavily. With Harold Keaton's true identity revealed, the balance of power inverted completely. The man who had been mocked became the most honored on the field. The one who believed he held authority became the one trembling under its weight. And every witness understood they were no longer part of a failed training exercise. They were standing inside a moment of history. And in that moment, as the entire range bowed in quiet acknowledgement of the truth, Harold's next step would become a living testament to what a true legend can do. Colonel Hale stepped closer to Harold and spoke in a low, steady voice filled with a reverence so palpable that everyone could feel its weight. "Mr. Keaton, please show these young men what it means to read the wind with your eyes." It wasn't an order. It was a request made to a master. Harold didn't answer. He simply walked toward the firing line. His steps carried the weight of memory, yet they were calm, as if this moment had lived inside him for a very long time. He set his old rucksack down and rested the M40 on top of it. A rifle that looked like it belonged to another era suddenly felt alive again the moment it settled into Harold's hands. He lay down on the shooting mat. No one told him to. No one guided him. It happened naturally, like a rhythm forged through years when silence meant more than applause. Harold let his eyes travel along the range, slow, deliberate, fully present. "Look at the grass on the right," he said softly, yet everyone heard him clearly. "It's leaning left. That's the first layer of wind." He shifted his gaze toward a patch of ground where heat shimmered upward. "The second layer is pushing to the right." Then he nodded toward the flag near the target. "And out there is the third. It's pulling back toward us." None of their expensive instruments had ever given such a precise answer. Harold placed his hand on the rifle's stock, his voice blending into the growing quiet machine's measure. "A soldier feels." A few Marines swallowed hard, not because the sentence sounded profound, but because it sounded true. True in a way that reached straight through the clutter of modern technology and tapped into something they had forgotten. Harold released half a breath and held the rest in his chest. The way seasoned marksmen do after surviving 100 moments where life hangs on a heartbeat. Then he squeezed the trigger. No one counted the seconds, but everyone felt those moments stretch longer than the entire morning combined. A silence so sharp it almost ached pressed down over the range. And then it came a sound they thought they would never hear that day, a single ringing strike of bullet against steel more than a mile away. No one managed to hold back their reaction. Some exhaled deeply. Some let out a quiet laugh, the tension finally breaking loose from their shoulders. But when they looked back at Harold, he simply rose to his feet. No triumphant smile. No searching for approval. Just a light brush of dust off his sleeve, as if the shot had been nothing more than something he needed to do, not to prove anything, but to remind them of a truth far too easy to lose. A soldier must understand the wind before he understands the rifle. Colonel Hale looked at him with open respect and said quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Keaton." Harold only nodded, as if everything that happened here was not glory, but a responsibility he had carried since his youth, a legacy he never claimed out loud, but never once abandoned. And from the echo of that distant steel strike, everyone understood that today's story was no longer about a failed training exercise. It was the moment one generation was reconnected with values they thought existed only in the pages of history. From that moment on, the true lesson began, a lesson not only for the young, but for those who believed they fully understood their place inside the uniform. After the bullet struck steel, the range still trembled with the echo of astonishment. But the silence that followed didn't come from Harold Keaton's shot. It came from the heavy disappointment in Colonel Hale's eyes as he turned to face Rourke. In that calm voice was a reminder that could stop any soldier cold. He said arrogance had never made anyone a better Marine, and that disrespecting a legacy standing right in front of you was the most dangerous mistake of all. Rourke didn't defend himself. He stood straight, but his shoulders tightened as if he were suddenly carrying a weight he had never noticed before. And at that moment, Harold stepped closer. He placed a hand on the young Marine's shoulder gently, far more gently than the way Rourke had gripped his shirt earlier back when he didn't know who he was humiliating. That touch drew every eye not because of its force, but because of the forgiveness inside it. Harold said that technology only helps you make fewer mistakes, but experience is what makes you right. A simple sentence, yet it cut straight through the pride of a man who had relied too long on numbers and meters. Rourke lowered his head. He apologized not because he'd been scolded in front of everyone, but because he realized he had let blind confidence turn him into an obstacle to the very legacy he once vowed to honor. Harold looked into the distance, and in that brief pause, the memory of the mentor who had handed him the M40 mount long ago returned. The old master sergeant, with a rasping voice shaped by countless monsoon seasons, had told him that the wind never lies. Only people do. Harold heard that sentence again inside himself, and he repeated it for the young men standing before him. Men who still had enough time to avoid the mistakes he had once paid for with blood. He told them to learn how to listen, not just measure. To let intuition, patience, and humility guide them, not cold numbers on a screen. These weren't instructions. They were pieces of Harold's heart, carried since he was 19, lying in a jungle trying to steady his breath so his brothers could live. When Harold lifted his hand from Rourke's shoulder, the tension on the range dissolved, but it left behind something deeper change. The young Marines no longer looked at him with curiosity, but with genuine respect. They understood now that a lesson could sharpen a skill, but Harold's lesson had reshaped the people they were. And from that moment forward, no one saw him as a quiet groundskeeper anymore. They saw him as the man who had preserved the soul of the sniper's craft, a soul no technology could ever replace. His lesson ended not with applause, but with a silence full of gratitude. And it was that very silence that opened the path to the next chapter. The chapter where everything Harold had passed down began turning into a living legacy in the steps of the young Marines gathered around him. After that fateful training session, the base began to change. Not through new slogans or loud directives, but through a quiet decision that carried tremendous weight. The Katon doctrine was officially added to the advanced sniper curriculum. They called it the Katon Wind Doctrine, and from that day on, reading the wind with one's eyes and intuition became a required part of every marksman's journey. No one objected. No one questioned it. Those who had witnessed that day understood that a great legacy had just been restored to its rightful place. Each week on the familiar stretch of earth, the young Marines sat in a circle around Harold. They listened to him talk about small, delicate things they had never considered important before the heaviness of the air, the warmth rising from the soil, the faint tremble of a single blade of grass. Harold wasn't lecturing. He was simply sharing through experience and the humility of someone who had lived too many years in the company of wind. And most notably, Rourke was always the first to arrive, sitting closest to Harold, sometimes even helping him carry his old rucksack. He wasn't trying to redeem himself anymore. He simply wanted to understand and rebuild the parts of himself from the point where he had once fallen. A month passed, and life on the base returned to its usual rhythm. Yet Harold's presence had become so familiar, so natural, that it was hard to believe he had once been just a quiet groundskeeper mowing grass each morning. Then one weekend, while picking up a few supplies at the farm store, Rourke spotted Harold standing in front of the tomato seed display. The old man's posture was straight, and his hands just as careful as when he held the M40. Rourke smiled and walked over, not with the hesitation of someone ashamed, but with the respect of someone who had learned far more than he expected. Harold glanced at him and returned the smile with that same gentle warmth he had come to recognize. Rourke admitted he had tried growing tomatoes, but the plants wouldn't grow. Harold looked at his basket for barely a second, before saying quietly, "You planted them too close. The wind couldn't get through." Those words made Rourke pause, not because of gardening technique, but because he understood Harold was reminding him of something deeper, the lesson he had given that day. Rourke nodded, feeling as if another door inside him had quietly opened. Harold placed a packet of seeds into his basket, greeted him with a small nod, and walked away with the unhurried grace of someone who required no titles to command respect. Rourke watched him go. He understood then that the old, unassuming man had given him something far more valuable than any modern device: a soldier's intuition, humility before nature, and the patience to listen to the things that hurry often forces people to ignore. It wasn't just a lesson on the firing range. It was a lesson in how to live. And in the moment Harold disappeared through the doorway, Rourke realized that some heroes never stand on a stage and never wear glittering medals. They simply live quiet as the wind to remind the generations after them that true courage does not always make a sound. Service honor stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, share this video and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.